I had an opportunity to take a look at the artwork that the 7th graders were doing here, and it's really incredible. I've been a part of this project now, well, going back to the original one, about 10 years ago when we started working with some local high schools on this, and now that we've sort of moved it over to the middle school range, it's been an amazing journey for us, I think, as well as for the students. I'm delighted that Dobbs Ferry is a part of this. I'm delighted that Connie kind of took this upon herself to do this. It's not that we're trying to be exclusionary about Westchester, it's just that we have a grant through the New York Community Trust to do this project with New York City schools, so it had to be written for New York City schools. So Connie is kind of an outlier here, and we're looking to expand this program after year 3 to Westchester and beyond. So we are kind of using this as a bit of an experiment as well to see how things are going to work outside the New York City School District. As Connie said, I work for Historic Hudson Valley. I'm their Associate Director for Content Development, and more or less a historian and researcher that has been researching into the work really about enslavement here in the colonial North quite deeply. As you guys can see, some of this might be surprising for us, some of it might not, but slavery in the North was around for about 200 years or so in our colonial history. New York began bringing in the first captive Africans as early as 1626, when this was still part of the Dutch New Netherlands. And it did not become illegal, or really abolition did not really reach New York until 1827. That's 201 years of New York's history of enslavement here. And if you do the math, since this is sort of social studies, I'll do the math for you. Since 1827 till today, freedom's only been around, I think, about 189 years. So slavery's actually existed here longer than freedom. So that's something I think that knocks us out a little bit when we put that in perspective. How many of y'all been to Phillipsburg Manor so far? Ever? When you were in the 4th grade as well. Phillipsburg Manor's story really focuses on the role of enslavement in the colonial North. For years we have told other stories there. There are plenty of stories to tell at Phillipsburg. The role of the Phillipses, the role of tenant farmers in this area. But we know that the only people actually living at Phillipsburg most of the time was a community of 23 enslaved men, women, and children. Connie had shown this in one of the documents there. So that's the story we've chosen to tell, the story of the people that were on the property. Phillipses owned 52,000 acres of land here in Westchester, from the Croton River all the way down to Spuyten and Duyvil. So that includes this whole area as well. It was all a part of Phillipsburg Manor in the 17th and 18th centuries. So some of those 23 men, women, and children would have been in this area. There were tenant farmers that rented Phillips's land. Some of those tenant farmers also owned slaves who would have been walking across the streets around here. The lives of those enslaved individuals are what we're trying to get these students to understand. Standing in their shoes, even for a few minutes, using their imagination to understand what it was to be considered property rather than person. One of the titles to one of the artworks, as I was looking around, he wrote it actually on his piece, "Freedom is not a crime." In the 18th century, it was a crime. Running away from your owner was, in effect, the law stated it as you were stealing yourself. You were stealing your labor from your owner. And so it was indeed a crime to run away in the 18th century. These runaway ads, I think, serve the purpose of getting folks to really understand this very odd concept of being considered property rather than person. We tell this at Phillipsburg a lot. The idea of being owned by somebody else. I mean, in one way it's theoretical and it's very hard to really grasp until you kind of break it down. Those 23 men, women, and children in Phillipsburg, they were listed as men on the inventory, men, women, and children. They weren't listed as families. But we know that most of those children on that list had the same names as many of the men on that property. There was a man named Caesar, there was a boy named Caesar, he was 2 years old. There was a man named Diamond, there was a boy named Diamond, he was 9 years old. There was a man named Samson, there was a boy named Samson. So it suggests we've got families going on here. But when Mr. Phillips died and that inventory was generated, a man who takes over that property, Mr. Phillips' nephew, Frederick, doesn't want the property. And he puts advertisements up in newspapers to lease or sell or auction off all of his late uncle's estate. We have one of those vendus, the Dutch word for auction, ad that came out in 1750. He put up for sale on auction 16 men, women, and children. One was a miller, one was a boatman, and then they listed down the list for this public venue. On that day, it was April 19th, 1750, on that day, a boy, Sam, was auctioned off for 62 pounds. Sam was 8 years old. Samson was his father. I mean, be Sam's dad for a minute, be Sam's mom for a minute. An 8-year-old boy, your boy, on an auction block being sold away from you. And that puts it into perspective what it is to be a property rather than a person. And I think that's what these students grasp as well, because they're that age. They're 12 years old. They're just 7th graders. I have a 12-year-old at home. You know, to try to figure that out and understand what it would be like to be sold away from your family, from your parents, to be moved aside as somebody else's property is really, it's a difficult thing to grasp, but it's clear that they can get it. Looking around this room, I mean, all of these stories that they put together through their imagination of understanding what the choices may have been for these individuals, what their lives would have meant for them. These kids are making these lives matter. Each one of these individuals had a runaway ad attached to them. They all made a choice to leave for some other reason. We don't know that reason. Those ads won't tell us the reason why these individuals left. But it's up to these students to bring these people back to life, to put that memory back and to make us remember these individuals would have been lost to history if it weren't for these students. These 7th graders had a lot of responsibility. I'm really proud. Look around the room, read these ads, because every one of them is using their imagination, but they're using it based on the history that they have learned. The primary documents that they picked from, the secondary sources that help fill in some of those gaps. But the real important thing is how these students worked it out in their head as to what it meant to be somebody else's property. Property that lived right here, on this land, crossing these streets, in this area 200 years ago. We are walking in those same footsteps. And I think that's a pretty deep story right there. So I thank you guys very much.